Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's great to see such a full room for I think, a very important event. This is a wonderful event for the New School. I think it showcases one of our distinguished faculty members. But it also engages several disciplines and areas of studies: economics, political science, development studies, global issues. And finally, I think it represents the best in the New School, consistent with our founding principles of being creative and innovative and always thinking outside the box, and also being publicly engaged in the real world's problems and issues. This book examines the causes of the economic and political crisis in Argentina in 2001 and the process of strong economic recovery there. I think that's especially timely, given that Argentina suffered their financial crisis some 6 years before it hit the rest of the world. And now the world is looking for new models to apply to financial and economic situations. The Argentine crisis and recovery may be able to, I hope it will be able to shed some substantial light on what we should be doing. And of course, as I mentioned, one of our great faculty is Michael Cohen, whose book is on display tonight. He's been at the New School since 2001. He's the director of our International Affairs program in the New School for Public Engagement. He has built that program into a very successful one with extensive connections throughout the globe. He had, before arriving here, had a distinguished career at the World Bank from 1972 to 1999. And it sounds actually like you were the New School working at the World Bank. You worked in over 50 countries, and you were heavily involved in the bank's work on urban issues, infrastructure, environment, and sustainable development. Finally, the author and editor of several books, and we're just pleased to have you here at the New School, and I'm looking forward to this. I do have some tough questions for you, though. So, all right? Very good. Thanks, David.
Thanks very much, David. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and I'm particularly delighted that Will Milberg and David Plotke, my colleagues from NSSR, could participate and comment. And I deliberately invited Will and David to participate because I thought it really was important to go across the disciplines and have sort of different perspectives about a piece of work that is intended to be multidisciplinary. So I'm delighted that everybody could be here. I wrote the first two-thirds of this book in 2008 when I was on sabbatical in Buenos Aires for a semester. And there's a kind of a motivating question behind the book, which I hope will sort of motivate the discussion this evening. The question really is, how could a country which had defaulted on its debt and then was generally condemned by the international community and for that action, and then assumed that it would never grow again. I mean, some people sort of assumed Argentina would fall off the bottom of Latin America, never to be seen again. How could it have grown at 7%, an average of 7%, between 2003 and 2007? What does the Argentine experience suggest for development strategies in other countries? At the time of 2001, nobody was thinking about Greece or Europe or Southern Europe. Today, I think the Argentine case is much more relevant to the broad economic crisis that the world is facing. So the real question at the root of the book is, what does the case of Argentina suggest for alternative development strategies? That's my interest. I'm interested in exploring how do you take the lessons and think about alternatives. Now, this evening, I'm going to talk about several aspects of the book. I only have 15, 20 minutes, so it can't be very long. But I thought, to kind of get you in the mood, I would show a video for 5 minutes about the crisis itself. We had this video prepared in 2002. Actually, in April of 2002, we had a conference at the New School on the crisis in Argentina. And so I just want you to see this for 6 minutes, and then we'll go on to the presentation.
Están abriendo las rejas. Esto es terrible. La pobreza que hay.
Están saqueando esta carnicería, esta maxi carnicería.
Hay hambre, en este barrio hay mucha hambre.
Hay muchísima gente, observen ustedes a lo lejos, y es toda la gente que viene avanzando y se van sumando cada vez más.
La represión es profunda, es continua, con gases lacrimógenos, con balas de gomas.
¿Qué le tira? Está tirando, bueno, está tirando. Argentina, 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 Argentina.
Tenemos en este momento en imágenes es el helicóptero presidencial que acaba de...
Argentina, 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 Argentina.
Vecinos de clase media, de clase baja, familias, muchas mujeres con chicos, algunas de las cuales han optado por permanecer en las inmediaciones de la Plaza de Mayo, pero alejándose un poquito del foco. Una casa de gobierno rodeada por ciudadanos de la ciudad de Buenos Aires.
Vení acá atrás, vení.
Usted se siente ya el gas lacrimógeno.
Banco Provincia, podemos ver, hay un incendio.
This is just to give you a flavor that there were some people who were pretty upset. What I'm going to do in the next 15, 20 minutes is to briefly talk about the crisis itself. What are its origins? What actually happened in 2001, 2002? Then to speak a little bit about the reactions of the foreign press, particularly the financial press, what the United States was saying. Then to talk about the process of recovery, what did it actually mean, how did it happen, and then to comment briefly on the four components of Kirchner's strategy and actually what happened from 2003 through 2007, and finally sort of the implications for theory and research and some additional questions that might be raised. Before getting into the crisis, I just want to remind you, I mean, this is 10 years ago. It's December 19th, 20th, 21st of 2001. I want you to remind you about the economic and political thinking of the 1990s. This was the period of the triumphalism in the West over the fall of the Soviet Union, about many writers kind of supporting the extreme position of Fukuyama, that we had arrived at the end of history, that there was no longer a debate about the market versus the state. The market had prevailed. And yet if we look carefully in the 1990s and we think about what happened in Latin America with the adoption of the so-called Washington Consensus, we see that the countries actually did grow between, say, 89 roughly and 94. And then there was something called the tequila crisis, where Mexico began to experience difficulties. And thereafter there were crises in 97, 98, 99, the East Asian financial crisis, the Russian crisis, the Brazilian crisis. And all of that led to an increase in interest rates, global interest rates, and concern about global risk. And for a country like Argentina with a lot of substantial external debt, that meant that the price of servicing that debt went up very, very much. And it began to create almost mathematically the impossibility that Argentina would ever be able to pay its debt. And at the same time, the IMF was arguing that the country needed to cut back on its budget, needed to adopt austerity conditions. And this whole process actually led to the contraction of the Argentine economy. It's interesting that in the period between 2002 and 2005, there were elections in 10 Latin American countries. And in those 10 countries, they adopted the existing regimes who had managed the Washington Consensus policies of the 90s. They were voted out. And so we had 10 new governments by 2005, which were basically committed to more progressive solutions. This has been referred to by some as the democratic fiesta, but in fact 250 million Latin Americans voted in this period and basically had rejected the policies of the 90s. So in a sense, the search for alternatives really began starting 2002, and the Argentine crisis plays a particularly important role in that search for alternatives. The end of history had not come to Latin America. The debate was just to begin. So when the crisis blew up in December of 2001, partly it was a result of unemployment, it was onerous debt, and there was enormous capital flight. Many people in the country had decided that what was necessary was to get their money, save their money, and take it out of the country. And partly in response to this, in December of 2001, the then finance minister, Domingo Cavallo, recommended to the president, then Fernando de la Rua, that there should be limits placed on how much people could withdraw from their own bank accounts. And that was set at 250 pesos, or at the time, $250. That meant $250 a week. I might say, Mr. President, we had students here from Argentina who suddenly lost their funds. We had tuition problems in our own version of how this had a reflection up here. This measure, known as the Corralito, immediately led to widespread protests, and when you saw some of this, it led to sacking supermarkets. The police attacked the demonstrators. On December 20th, 26 people were killed, and the following day the president resigned, and you saw the picture in the helicopter. That was actually the president resigning and leaving. It couldn't really be more dramatic than that. Now, this episode of those last days of December of 2001 had been preceded by many discussions from the IMF and so-called support from the IMF, and the advice, in fact, that Argentina could make its way out of the crisis of debt, could find an economic policy which was sustainable. One of the last acts of the Clinton administration in early 2001, was to have supported a $40 billion bailout from the IMF, which went to Argentina. And I remember New Year's Eve of 2000, standing on a street corner in Buenos Aires and seeing a poster which said, "This shield will mean sustained growth for Argentina." And on the other side of the poster, somebody had written in graffiti, "To pay the external debt would be a human rights crime." And so there was tremendous conflict and difference in perceptions of what was really possible and what could happen in this context. In the weeks following the resignation of De La Rua, there were 5 presidents of Argentina nominated through various congressional processes. Finally, Eduardo Duhalde was nominated by the Congress. And one of the important actions in those several weeks was to declare a default on the external debt, and secondly, to devalue the peso. So no longer was the 1 peso equaling $1, but rather was 1 to 3 or 1 to 4. It was set up on a floating basis. So the second part of the story really is the reactions from the North. And this, I must say, is, I hope you find this enjoyable, because it's an interesting reflection of what our leaders are saying today. So the first thing, the New York Times in early January 2002 made the comment that Mr. Bush, George W., had made a decision to let Argentina suffer the consequences of its own economic mismanagement. The United States needed to apply a policy of, quote, tough love. That was the phrase the White House was using. That a hard line in Argentina would send a message to the rest of the developing world that the United States would not support bailouts, would not support governments that were not managing their own affairs in an effective way. it was clear that the assumption in this position from the United States was that it was Argentina's fault. There was no reference to the IMF. There was no reference to policies which had been communicated and advised to Argentina, but it was the Argentines' fault for this problem, for a lack of economic management. The position was further supported by Jeff Sachs in an article in the Financial Times in the second week of January. We said, quote, "I do not know of another country with Argentina's capacity to abuse, manipulate, freeze, confiscate, and periodically replace the national currency." Okay. I mean, extraordinary. This is the Jeff Sachs who had recommended shock therapy in Poland and the Soviet Union. 2 days later, the New York Times had another alarmist article worrying about contagion and reminding people that Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Brazil were soon to have elections. And God forbid that the Argentine crisis would provide, quote, ammunition for candidates who didn't understand the unbreakable link between democracy and the northern model of an open economy. All right? So the Times was supporting this. Then Martin Wolf from the Financial Times wrote an article calling "The Mess Dualde is Making." He said, "Eduardo Dualde, the president of Argentina, quote, is a remarkable man. In 2 weeks as president, he's demonstrated why Argentina's politicians cannot be trusted with their own economy." Can't be stronger than that. In Argentina, the crisis was very dramatic. By May 2002, 56% of the population was below the poverty line. There was unemployment on the order of 28%. In 2002, 2003, there were 13,000 demonstrations in the country in protesting the collapse of the economy, the inability of the political system to manage this. And the slogan of this period was "Se vayan todos," which meant throw the bastards out, throw everybody out, regardless of political party. And I think it really reached a very poignant moment when on the front page of one of the key newspapers, they had pictures of starvation in the northern part of Argentina that really looked like pictures from Biafra in the 60s. And this was a tremendous shock to the kind of collective national consciousness of the country, that the country had absolutely fallen. And if you look at the per capita income figures at that period, it had fallen below some of the poorest countries of Latin America. In Colombia, there was a newspaper article that said, "Argentina, welcome to Latin America." Right. The key fact of the recovery really had to do with the devaluation. That the devaluation to go from 1 to 1, $1 to 1 peso, to go from $1 to 3 pesos or 4 pesos, made imports expensive and exports cheap. So no longer could imports be afforded by the Argentine population. And the result of this was that the demand for these goods led to an enormous production by the domestic market, by the installed capacity in the country. And this is what has been referred to as a demand-led recovery. And this is very important because the devaluation really created incentives for Argentina's own producers to produce products and services that were necessary. And here's where Argentina's long history with a lot of installed capacity, a skilled labor force, an educated population, this supply response was able to come relatively quickly. It started in the second half of 2002 and continued really until the global crisis of 2008. By 2007, some of the limits on this capacity began to be felt, and then we began to see more inflationary pressures. But in fact, the period between the end of 2002 and 2007, things were going very well. From late 2004, with the export of soya and other commodities to China, the country was also able to get lots of benefits from lots of income from agricultural exports. But this doesn't explain the story, because important Argentine economists have observed that the export earnings didn't come until later, and the recovery had started before. Okay? So there's a narrative in the press that, quote, Argentina was lucky. It was lucky because China was importing a lot of soya, but in fact, this was a small part of what was going on. Nestor Kirchner was elected president in May of 2003. He only had 22% of the vote. He had come in second. Menem had come in with 24% of the vote. The other candidates had left. And according to Argentine law, there was to be a runoff. But it was clear from all the polls that Menem was not going to receive substantially more votes, and that Kirchner would win. So Menem withdrew, and Kirchner was, in effect, elected president, but with only 22% of the votes. He basically adopted 4 key points in his strategy when one looks back at this. And this is what I think is the most interesting part of the whole story. The first was, he said, we're not going to worry about the external debt while we have hunger in the country, while we have unemployment in the country. What he was saying was, we're going to privilege domestic concerns over international obligations. And this represents an enormous shift from what was going on with most developing countries. Almost all the countries believed that they had to respond to their debt obligations, they had to meet all of those obligations. And Kirchner said simply, this is an unethical position. He said it here in the New School in September 2003 when he came and spoke. And when pressed by the Financial Times and others, he said, no, this is the ethical position. We can't worry about the external lenders while we're in such a terrible situation. This was repeated many times, not only by Nestor Kirchner, but also by his wife, Senator Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, when she came here. And this, I really think, was understood as not just a strategic economic approach, but it was an ethical position. And I think that was really quite important. Of course, Argentina did have to pay its bonds. It did have to face up to its debt. And so Kirchner offered to pay a deal in which Argentina would pay 25%, 25 cents on the dollar for some of the Argentine bonds. Many bondholders thought this was outrageous, but in fact, the returns to the bonds had been much higher in many countries. And this wasn't such a terrible solution, and 76% of the bondholders actually finally accepted this, allowing the country to write down some of the debt and then able to get on a much more sustainable basis. One of the interesting aspects of this recovery process was Kirchner's decision to build up the country's reserves and not to spend this money on external debt. And this is kind of ironic, because this was sharply criticized by the IMF. This is 2003, 4, and 5. The IMF was furious. They said, you have this money, you're not spending it to meet your obligations. But this was the same IMF which had said in 98 and 99, you should have saved, when things were good, you should have saved money for a rainy day. Okay? So there was this tremendous contradiction in the fund's advice, and the fund really didn't know what to do. The other comment that was made in this period was, what was the level of responsibility of the IMF in this whole process? And one of the things that I discovered in the research for the book was that there's an elegant paper written by the economist William Klein in Washington, where he looked at the explanations of a dozen economists. And most of the economists blamed Argentina for this. Not Joe Stiglitz. Joe Stiglitz said that he thought a lot of this had to do with the bad advice from the fund. But part of the whole argument really is that Kirchner's position was, we're going to worry about domestic conditions and hunger and unemployment before we're going to pay off the debt. So that's the first comment, which I think is, really summarizing, is kind of a key point. The second point, which was also marked a departure from the way in which these questions have been discussed, is he took the position that the state itself had to be strengthened. In 2000, 2001, 2002, Kirchner was writing about what he called the absent state. He said, here we find ourselves in a situation of great problems, of a lot of people who are very needy in the country, but we've privatized so much, we've undermined the capacity of the state, that we're not in a position really to help as much as we need to. One should be reminded that Menem, during the 90s, privatized 22 different services. He privatized more in 2 years than Mrs. Thatcher had done in 10 years. The Argentina privatization program was held up by the bank and the fund as being such an excellent example, but in fact it substantially weakened the state. So Kirchner's view was that he really had to rebuild the state, and that meant all the different branches of the state. And one of the interesting things here is that he started with the Supreme Court. With the Supreme Court at that time was widely understood as having been kind of packed by Menem and politically biased, and he argued that some of the judges needed to retire, and he opened up a process in which the government nominated people to be members of the Supreme Court and then set up a process where any citizen could comment on that nomination. And there were public hearings and people coming in and saying, well, this judge, this candidate's not so good, others, incredible. I mean, I don't think we have this equivalent process here. That level of, I defer to a former dean of a law school, but it was very interesting how open it was in terms of this question. Another area that was very important in the strengthening of the state was the issue of regulation, because if the country had come through a period of mass privatization, the real question now was how would you regulate all of these private enterprises. So the whole regulatory structure was substantially enhanced. Another dimension was really supporting the Ministry of Labor and believing that employment was a critical issue. And so the Labor Ministry over this period turns out to be one of the real stars in the story, really focusing a lot on reducing unemployment and focusing on the quality of employment. And probably the most important aspect of building up the state was to make the decision, and here's the third point of the Kirchner strategy, is to focus public expenditures on the poor, to really have a social orientation, to worry about the people who were most hit by the crisis. And so in the period of the Kirchner, the first Kirchner mandate of the 5 years, there was enormous support for programs for the poor, for female-headed households, for the elderly, for increases in pensions, for a whole series of programs. And ironically, many of these programs were financed by the World Bank. And the bank was very pleased to be able to support Argentina without having to get into arguments about the macro strategy, but they were actually doing that. So the fourth component of the Kirchner strategy, which is also interesting and which is also discussed here at the New School by the former president, was that he needed to follow a strategy in a regional framework. He needed to think about support from Brazil, relationships with Bolivia, with Venezuela, with other countries who were interested in supporting the country. So the trade relationships with Brazil in this period were enhanced. The relationship with Bolivia around natural gas was renegotiated. And it's very interesting to think that actually while he was trying to forge this independent path, at the same time there was considerable regional support. And I think it's a very interesting kind of view. Now, in hindsight, these four strategic decisions don't seem particularly remarkable. You know, they're not that radical in the sense of such an enormous departure, except perhaps this idea that you privilege the domestic over international concerns. But when you think about this in the context of Greece, and you think about this in the context of other kind of cases we found, they represented a really important challenge to neoliberalism and ways of thinking about economic policy. My approach to these questions and thinking about it has been to argue that Argentina's recovery is not just about economic policy. It's also about politics. It's also about a state-building strategy by Kirchner and reaching out to a broad constituency of people. What's interesting to think about is the difference between the slogan, throw all the bastards out, versus the fact that when he left in 2007, he had a 70% approval rating. So clearly the political process and the underlying these kind of economic policies, they really worked. It didn't mean that those 5 years were not tremendously contentious, all kinds of disputes, tremendous attacks from the media about this. But when his wife, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, was elected in 2007 with 45% of the vote, 22 points ahead of the second place finisher, this was the largest margin in Argentine history. So clearly the continuity was also meaning something in political terms. The book sets this analysis in the framework of two theoretical issues. The first is the issue of neoliberalism itself. And one of the questions that I ask is, how did Argentina come to adopt these policies in the 90s? what had led up to this. Was this inevitable? Why deregulate the labor market? Why privatize all of these services? Why follow the IMF so closely? What was the regional context in which this happened? Why were there other countries doing the same thing? Why didn't they fall to the same extent that Argentina fell? And importantly, how did the performance of those policies, how does this lead then to the rejection of the Washington Consensus in the period 2002 to 2005? The second theoretical issue is the issue of state performance. And one of the really interesting processes for me in writing the book was having an exchange with my editors at Routledge about how this story connected to a broader set of questions. And one of those questions really was state performance. And as you know, as some of you know, and maybe not everybody's into this, but some of you know, that there's this huge literature on state performance. And the question of state performance goes back to the debates in the Cold War. It goes back to state versus market in the management of the economy. It goes back to the discussions after African independence in 1960 about the importance of states versus societies, and the whole debate in political science and in public administration about the role of the state and state performance. It then shows up in the 90s with work, for example, by Peter Evans, talking about the role of the state in supporting markets and this kind of development. So part of what I do in the book is try to touch on these theoretical issues as well in order to explain the story. And it really goes to a comment that was made here to me while I was working on this by Arjun Appadurai when he was here, and he asked me the question, so what is this a case of? And I don't think I've actually really answered that question, but it's a good question. And I think it relates to how this fits into the broader debate about countries and their ability to survive in a globalized economy. So the final thing I'd like to say, question I'd like to pose, is this story applicable to other countries? In some respects, yes. Losing control of monetary policy through the convertibility plan, which Argentina did, as Greece has done in the context of the EU, was clearly disastrous, because it's hard to manage an economy only with fiscal policy, and if you can't control the currency, you can't really manage some of these things. Focusing on urban employment was a very important thing because it maintained what's called aggregate demand, and because aggregate demand was high, the Argentine economy was able to grow, consumption was high. And that actually helped position the country in order to be able to respond to the crisis in 2008. And that was really, really important. Is this a completely successful story? No. I think the government has made mistakes on various issues. It didn't recognize early enough to address, for example, energy policy and invest in energy. There are lots of debates about its changing of the methodology for calculating inflation. Those statistical issues are big issues, and they're a problem. There are questions about how the government managed some of the relationships, particularly with the media, over various issues, particularly export taxes in 2008. But I think it is fair to say that Argentina did not fall off the bottom of Latin America. It was able to grow. It was able to survive what is understood historically as one of the worst economic crises in world history. And last year, the economy grew at 8.9%. So when we compare it to where we are, one has to say this is pretty remarkable that they were able to do that. But the story is also about the leadership of the Kirchners themselves. And I think that's something which needs to be mentioned. For a president to enter the office with 22% in the vote and to leave with 70% approval rating and to take his country through that period is really quite an extraordinary thing. When after he died unexpectedly in 2010, and Cristina then ran for a second term, she got 54% of the vote, and the second place finisher had 14%. So clearly this is a political success story, even though it's incredibly contentious, and I'm not really conveying the level of angst and conflict that's in the media every other minute in the country. But I think it's a very interesting story. So the book, in the end, is an effort to pull together parts of these questions and to try to locate the Argentina case within this broader case of globalization, of what's happened in Latin America, about development strategy, and hopefully it will be more accessible to an English-speaking audience. Thank you.
That was a great presentation, and I want to first of all thank Michael for inviting me to give some comments. When he asked me to do this, I thought, well, I hope he will reciprocate when my book comes out. Maybe he'll reciprocate. Now that I'm here, I realize what I really want is not Michael, but his marketing department. Look at this is remarkable. This is a book launch, for God's sake. This is a very important book. It gives us a close account and interpretation of one of the remarkable episodes in recent economic history. Mike's account of all these dimensions of Argentine political economy is detailed, nuanced, filled with summaries of political debate, standoffs, rich with appreciation of the unequal ways in which the economic benefits are shared as the economy recovered from this massive macroeconomic collapse in 2001. What I want to talk about in my few minutes here is conventional wisdom in economics, and maybe it provides an answer to Arjun's question of what is this a case of? It seems to me, as I read the book, it's a case of the defiance of conventional wisdom in economics. So I want to organize my comments around a number of ways in which especially the recovery has really defied the traditions of economic thinking in ways that are important and worth really thinking about, and which put economic conventional wisdom into serious question. This is a fast-paced book. There are blow-by-blow accounts of this newspaper kind of hyperactivity, of macroeconomic extremes in terms of debt, of exchange rate and fiscal trade balance and monetary policy swings. But when I finish reading the book, take a big exhale. It's really a great narrative. It's a great read in that sense. What really struck me, and I'm not at all an expert in Argentina by any stretch, what struck me most were the many ways in which the Argentine experience just contradicts conventional wisdom. So let me start. Conventional wisdom number one. Conventional wisdom is that default on foreign debt will have disastrous consequences for economic growth. It's economic suicide. Country that defaults, so the logic goes, immediately shuts it out of international capital markets for an unpredictably long time. Who knows how long you will be cut off from foreign lending, brings a long-term collapse of the exchange rate, requires a long-term recession as the country is forced to live within its means. So subsequent to the default, the story that Mike tells with all its blemishes is 1 year later, it's borrowing from the World Bank or from the Inter-American Development Bank at fairly record levels for the year 2002. Between 2002 and 2006, inward foreign direct investment rose at 26% a year. Capital is flooding in direct investment. 5 years later, we have the growth rates that Mike described, funding of new social programs, poverty reduction programs, and fairly sound fiscal stance. So the suicide of default, clearly that conventional wisdom goes by the wayside. Conventional wisdom number two. Globalization is a process that drastically reduces the power of the nation state, since increased capital mobility means that capital's interests no longer coincide with those of the nation state, and anyway the state's influence over capital and the economy generally is diminished because capital and labor can simply move or shift production locations internationally if domestic policies put it at a disadvantage. Argentina's example in a time of default is of increased power of the national government, increased importance of the government, both obviously in setting macro policy, bringing in this foreign capital I discussed, but also in shifting social policy. This increased power of the state, which really comes through in the discussion, particularly of the Kirchner administrations. First, though, over the decision to default on the debt, and then to run these very active jobs programs, redistribution policies. In fact, the strong state, Nestor Kirchner's strong state, was criticized. I mean, Mike hinted at that, but was criticized for being too strong in the age of globalization. Conventional wisdom number 3. So it's a corollary of conventional wisdom number 2 about the diminished power of the nation state in the era of globalization, is that one size fits all. And this is, I don't need to say much about this, this is Michael's critique of neoliberalism. That neoliberalism was a package of policies, fiscal and monetary constraint, current and capital account liberalization, removal of subsidies. These are the basic requirements of any structural adjustment. And as a result of this thinking, which we know comes from the US and Europe, these became the basics of IMF and World Bank conditionality policies in one form or another in all their loans made throughout the later part of the 20th century. So Michael's account of the Argentina experience in the run-up to the default is a case of the neoliberal operation being a success, but the patient dying. Hyperinflation is cured, the debt becomes unsustainable. The account since default is a description of a complicated set of deviations from the policy prescription, as he described, with considerable success. Higher taxes, pro-poor redistribution and spending, job creation programs, loose monetary policy, careful attention to managing the exchange rate in a competitive way. This was the political foundation for the growth that he described in the later part of the middle part of the 2000s, completely defying the one-size-fits-all conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom number 4, Latin American wisdom, in this case, from Prebisch and Singer, that developing countries should actively seek to avoid a pattern of specialization which is too reliant on commodities and primary goods. These types of goods have a low income elasticity of demand, so as the rest of the world grows, you will not have the same type of demand growth as you would with other goods. There's no market power in these type of standardized goods, and labor bargaining power is very limited in those sectors. What happened in Argentina in the 2000s was a period of rapid economic recovery, strongly supported by global commodities boom, a boom that drove an explosion of exports and which had considerable multiplier effects across the economy, continuing to this day. The terms of trade in the soybeans is up 50% in the last decade, remarkable. Conventional wisdom number 5 is that the commodity boom was the main driver of recovery and growth. And this one, Mike spends a lot of time debunking in the paper and is very careful to debunk for reasons that will become obvious, which is that he is interested in the political dimensions of the recovery and the political drivers of the importance of economic policy in that recovery, and the demand-led, domestic demand-led recovery, he argues, is the driver. And the export boom comes later, as he said, and it simply adds to that domestic demand-led recovery. By the way, the domestic demand-led recovery, I won't mention it in detail, but it's an additional conventional wisdom that fiscal austerity is what you should adopt in a time of crisis. And of course, we see that that was not what was done in Argentina. We see that avoiding that conventional wisdom was quite important, but I'm just going to stop on that because that's next week. Mike is giving a talk on that topic. That's marketing, my style. Conventional wisdom number 6. With the rise of China, the conventional wisdom has grown around the view that autocracy is the most important or the most able form of state control for promoting development. Increasingly, Chinese success is connected to the autocratic nature of the political system. It's the absence of democratic accountability, the conventional wisdom goes, that has allowed the Chinese government the ability and nimbleness to harness labor and capital investment in a massive industrialization effort. And we know that the story of Argentina in the period of recovery is one of democracy. It's one of democratic support, rigorous political debate, and very overwhelming democratic support for the regime. Conventional wisdom number 7 is that these trade protectionism in the form of import tariffs is the most important economic distortion and thus the first step required in economic liberalization. And in Argentina, and this is really a riveting chapter in the book, which you didn't talk about in your presentation today, is the battle over export tariffs, not import tariffs, which is the typical story. So Argentina goes through this enormous battle over the effort by the government to impose tariffs on grain and commodities exporters, and runs into just a huge political resistance from agro-industry. And this is, as I say, it's kind of a blow-by-blow account by Mike, which is really had me on the edge of my seat. Again, defies conventional wisdom about what trade policy is about. Conventional wisdom number 8 is that the tide of economic growth will raise all boats. The friendly World Bank amendment to this has been that one also needs good institutions, clear property rights protection. The conventional wisdom is that economic growth per se is the central means to the improvement of well-being and the reduction of poverty. And the Argentine case shows that growth alone was not adequate. And Mike goes to great efforts in the book to attribute the progress on poverty, the progress on employment creation, to the Kirchner government efforts to support housing, to support job creation, to support social protection and infrastructure. So growth alone is not enough, and the conventional wisdom needs some very serious rethinking in this regard. Last piece of conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom is that the international financial institutions are more powerful than domestic political forces. Thus the old joke that the World Bank has brought down more governments than have national revolutionary movements. Cohen's account tells the fascinating story of a country that defaults on its foreign debt in the face of enormous IMF pressure not to do so, international pressure generally. Then just a few years later, the government, elected with the largest plurality in decades, finds itself in an unwinnable battle about export taxes. And what's perhaps the most unconventional part of this book is the way Mike tells the economic story of Argentina in a time, the way he tells it. And again, he hinted at this in his presentation, but he didn't elaborate. He tells the story, contrary to economists. He argues that all economic processes must be understood as political, that economic change comes generally, and I quote him, with a major realignment of political power. Now this is a notion or a sensibility that Paul Krugman came to in the last few years, when he started to understand that income distributional trends in the US were very much driven by politics and not so much by economic technicalities. Mike has been working and researching under this premise for decades, and I think the GPIA, he has really instilled the curriculum of the GPIA with this notion of the importance of political change in driving economic change. Even more interesting is Mike's insistence that you can't assess economic policy in some pure way, but only in the context of its institutional and political overlay. This leads him to strongly resist the notion of the end of history or the end of politics in Latin America. The book resounds with a very hopeful view of the possibilities of creativity, innovation in policy making and poverty reduction, management of urban development, but with a realistic sense of the limits of politics. And one of his great sensibilities in the book is his ear for geographical issues, how space is affected by these economic policies and these policies and economic changes. His views on these issues are closest to those of Peter Evans. And Evans has this notion of embedded autonomy. The idea is that of embedded autonomy is that the most effective developmental states are closely connected to economic and civil society actors, but they have sufficient autonomy to be able to implement policy effectively, even when that impact is not favorable to one or more groups of actors, or to implement policies with long-term development reasons rather than for short-term economic gain. So you need to be connected very richly to civil society and economic actors, but autonomous enough to be able to implement policies that don't necessarily please everybody. So embedded autonomy is really the idea that instills this book with a lot of very rich interdisciplinary analysis. This is a really useful lens with which to think about our economic policy making in Argentina. With its history of Peronism, military dictatorship, and now democracy, it's particularly relevant in the Kirchner era, which at various moments was accused of being too embedded and at times too autonomous. So I would be remiss if I didn't speak of Mike's own problem of embedded autonomy. Everyone knows that Mike has been personally friendly with the Kirchners over many years, and that they have supported with their presence, for example, at this observatory on Latin America. So the big question, when I opened the cover of this book, the big question I asked myself was, did Mike have embedded autonomy? It was whether Mike would pull his punches in the assessment of the Kirchner government. He was embedded. Did he have autonomy? The answer is that he doesn't pull his punches. He's mostly supportive of the government. He's very supportive of their efforts at redistribution and policy alleviation, but he does this with a distinct analytical frame and based on a clear set of principles, that economic growth alone does not alleviate problems of extreme inequality, persistent poverty, lack of access to health care. While the rapid recovery following default is remarkable, he does not let the reader lose sight of the perhaps more remarkable feat, which is the recovery from a brutal military dictatorship of 1976-1983 to a strong democracy that seems to have come not just with ambitions of voting rights, but also of economic rights. He's critical of the Kirchners in a number of places, mostly for ignoring important aspects of long-term social well-being related to the development of science, technology, infrastructure, the apparent collapse of energy production over the last decade that really may cripple the economy going forward. So my economist friends who know about Argentina tell me that Argentina is once more on the edge. The economy may well be spiraling into another crisis. Exchange rate is overvalued once again. Capital flight, expansionary fiscal policy that may be difficult to sustain, inflation taking off. The government appears to be falsifying the consumer price index, according to some, which is quite dangerous because it can lead to all kinds of distortions, both in perception and in the actual exchange rate, for example. So while Mike covers the politics of this in much detail, he really is insufficiently critical of the government in its dangerous politicization of this. The recent law regarding the accountability of the central bank makes sense. It's a good thing, but the political pressures that it creates for monetary policy to finance deficits are not necessarily good. So I want to just end by saying that the Cambridge economist, quoting the Cambridge economist Joan Robinson, who famously said that time is a device which keeps everything from happening at once, and space is a device which keeps everything from happening at Cambridge. When I read Mike Cohen's book, Argentina's Economic Growth and Recovery, one gets the sense that for Mike, space is a device which keeps everything from happening in Buenos Aires. And by Buenos Aires, I mean its 19 municipal districts, figured and characterized, described very clearly in Table 9.11, because he's very careful about that. I want to congratulate you on the book. It's a great book. It reflects a deep appreciation for political culture, economic history, the geographic complexity, the class differences, the international pressures that Argentines have struggled with over the past 2 decades. It's really an important treatise in political economy, and Mike tells in detail and with a lot of passion and even at times some frustration about this remarkable period of history. My sense is that both of these sentiments, passion, frustration, are actually quite conventional among Argentines. Thank you.
So I'm going to be briefer than the 2 excellent prior speakers, not because I'm a better citizen, just because I think I probably got less to say. But I would like to start with one observation that I'm a friend of Mike's, happy to be, so I would discount that in what I'm about to say totally, which is I think it's amazing that as the director of a program, he actually published a book. I mean, I would say, even if it was a crappy book, that would still be an accomplishment. And what I mean by that is, I have had the good fortune of chairing departments and similar things around here for about 10 years, and watching my friends and colleagues chair things or be deans or program directors, and that's it for scholarship during that period of time. So he politely said that he got some modest leave before sabbatical that helped him do the research on this. So what? People who get into the kind of jobs he's had just find that what it's really like, and having done it so long, I mean, it's like owning a small Greek restaurant. That you have to be the guy who goes down to the port to check to see if the fish are okay, and to make sure you get the ones that don't smell bad. You have to be the guy who goes talk to the waiter who's drinking too much and tells her or him to stop it. And so you become this sort of small business owner running a small project. And so I won't go on, but I think it's a great accomplishment that is very rarely duplicated. And I think his personal and deep connection to Argentina probably helped keep him going. But also the other thing, which I tell my PhD students, is it's much easier to finish your dissertation or write your book if you actually know what your argument is. And don't see it all as a sort of opportunity for self-exploration. And maybe if you go along for a while, you'll eventually find an argument, and then usually what happens is you get waylaid, and especially if you're in Mike's kind of position, you can't do that. You have to know what you're doing. So he is really to be commended. So I'll raise a few questions, several which are quite within the terms of the discussion so far, and one or two of which are slightly outside it. What is this a case of? Well, I do think I have an answer. That in post-1989 circumstances, rather than the world becoming Hayekian, there turn out to be a whole range of what I would call social market economies of different kind, where the main economic institutions are owned privately, but the degree of regulation of them varies a lot. The degree of the state's action in providing social services and welfare varies. And one other dimension, which doesn't get much attention because of Argentina's peculiarities, the extent to which the state plays an active role in trying to develop new economic sectors varies quite a bit. So you can think of the Czech Republic, South Africa in a different way, number of other countries. I would say that Argentina is in some ways on the center left, or maybe even the left of this set of newer social market economies. And an interesting comparison, if his book had another chapter, I think one that would have really, maybe for another essay, is to compare Chile and Argentina with different paths out of dictatorships and different political configurations. But basically Argentina helps change the conversation along with a number of other countries, so that the choice is not Hayek versus Brezhnev in these newer settings, but a range of configurations. I mean, it's a one interesting comparison here, and I presume this is that a lot of you have at least partly a political science background. There's a huge discussion in the analysis of OECD countries organized around this notion of varieties of capitalism, insisting on the diversity of possible forms of modern, more or less democratic capitalism. And for various reasons, that robust discussion has not, it's in practice observed as a reality of non-OECD countries, but not theorized as much. And Argentina is in effect an important part of that discussion. And one simple way of putting it, I can't put it as fully or elegantly as Will put it, one element of thinking about this is whether we think of the international political economy as a vice like a grip or a net. That is, does it strongly and uniformly constrain choices of national economies, or does it place constraints on them that to some degree are malleable. And clearly Argentina confirms the second kind of image as more appropriate. So far I'm essentially maybe adding a little bit, but retracing the comments already made. As a political scientist, one question that arose for me as I read the book and I thought about Argentina is a very simple one. Why in the context of Argentine history did democratic politics persist in 2002 and later? Argentina has a terrible political history. It's featured, there's a famous article, probably a third of the room has read it, by Adam Jaworski, where he tries to link the levels of GDP per capita of countries with their prospects of being democratic over time. And he spends about a fifth of the article teasing Guillermo O'Donnell, who's Argentine, and saying, listen, Argentina just doesn't fit into this story because it is arguably, with the exception of Brunei and some other outliers, one of the least democratic countries historically at its GDP per capita level. Well, so that presents, this is not Mike's book, but it's a response of mine to it. What is it? What happened to Argentina or to the United States or even to the IMF that meant that a crisis as wrenching as this did not produce the normal prior pattern common in Argentina and elsewhere in Latin America? And the typical pattern would be there would be no deal on the debt of this kind. There would be an insistence on the full austerity package plus repayment, and that could not be carried out through democratic institutions. So you had then various coalitions that would step in to secure that. So why did that is the loudest barkiest dog in Argentine history as their way of solving these periodic economic problems. So what happened? I pose this if I were a specialist, a person probably who should be in the room for this, and we already have enough speakers, is Federico Finkelstein, might be able to tell us something about that. But it's a fascinating puzzle of something that didn't happen, that we might well have expected over time. I suspect, well, I won't say my suspicion because I don't know. Then the other thing is that this is a difficult book to publish, and I guess the last theme that I'll just say briefly is it's hard to win. It's hard to know what to do after you win. That is to say, that this book is representative of political currents that in some sense have won in the last 10 years, okay? And the neoliberalism of 1989, 1993 is no longer, can be depicted as a uniform, hegemonic apparatus of thought and belief that spreads throughout the world. I was doing a thought experiment while Mike was the point is not to say that Mike is wrong, but that Mike's book, the experience of countries like Argentina and others, have changed the actual terrain for international political and economic discussion. So what do you do then? Imagine as a thought experiment, not the 1989-90 World Bank and IMF guys, but Obama's new World Bank guy, and your average, IMF is a little trickier, granted, but as a set of them in the audience, okay? It's absolutely not the case that they would present themselves in a relationship of pure antagonism toward Mike's book and argument. So the irony here is it's in every respect better to win. I'm not making this, it's better to lose and be marginal and crushed, because then you get to be resentful and pure and have an honest heart. That's not my point. But one of the challenges of winning is that you can then no longer write more fighting they're not ghosts exactly, but fighting the diminished figures and half ghosts who now you have defeated, and now you have a much richer, more challenging intellectual environment to face, in which you have to develop your positions in a more positive and complicated way. So I think we are all tremendously fortunate to have Mike with us to help in that exploration and argument over the next few years. That's it.
Well, should we think, what time do we have? We have, should we open to questions from the audience, Rob? Yeah, any questions? We can pepper in here as well as we go along. Yeah.
You need to speak in the microphone because it's being taped.
Oh. Try that one here.
Thank you very much. What were the exact policies that Argentina established that increased the aggregate demand as far as in the urban areas? You spoke about that. And then also, as far as Professor Plotke has raised an interesting question as far as why was the debt allowed to be forgiven as far as 25 cents on the dollar? Was it because of the economic crises around the world, and then also because the world needed the commodities that Argentina had?
Maybe take several questions.
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. Yeah, why don't you come use that.
You mentioned briefly, I guess, in the book you deal with export policy or export trade policy, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about trade policy more generally. It seems to me that both Kirchner administrations have talked a lot about trade surpluses as being one of the pillars of the model, and recently it seems to me that the Fernández de Kirchner government has talked a lot more about ISI policies more explicitly than they used to. And it's been sort of curious to me to hear ISI being talked about as something seemingly novel, considering that in Argentina, even among sort of left economists and scholars, there's been a great deal of sort of literature discussing the sort of problems in Argentina with regard to ISI and the way in which it leads to sort of either inflationary spirals or balance of trade crises and that kind of thing based on the various social groups that it antagonizes, I suppose. In any case, I was curious to get your opinion on how you view sort of the contemporary import trade policies in Argentina.
Why don't you come up if you want to. Sorry. The drawbacks having a big crowd, it's tough to get up to the mic.
Well, I want to congratulate Mike because he has two challenges, very difficult challenges. One is to try to explain Argentina. Almost impossible. But the second, that maybe is even more important, to have bring some lessons from that country to more general situation in development. So you start talking about the debt and human rights. I would like you to elaborate a bit more about this connection and the idea of human rights, not only political rights, but social rights in the models in Latin America. Thank you.
Let me ask the political question, since that's your focus. And this goes a little bit to Professor Plotke's point, too. What gave Argentina that autonomy? Because if we're thinking about the United States in current crisis, which is still ongoing, and we're thinking about Greece, which has a very strong social, economic foundation in civil society as well as government, they don't seem to have that autonomy, unless we are just bamboozled by rhetoric. So I'm wondering what gave Kirchner that autonomy to pursue the policies, rather than maybe lean towards something else or some compromise. So that's more of a political question, really.
Well, following up David's challenge, well, there was very little talk either in your Mike's presentation or in the two comments, which were both fantastic, I thought, about the implications of this for the current crisis in Europe. And so I wondered if you could, Argentina broke with the dollar, so, there's obvious implications for Greece and some other countries.
Let's take one more, and then, because we got so many lined up here. I hope you got all the good notes.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
My question is related to the one Everita asked. It's sort of the other side of the coin, and also related to the question that was just asked. If one of the lessons you draw from Argentina's case was the strong role of the state in taking over, then what does this say for the EU vis-a-vis Greece? Because one of the comments or one of the challenges that people have said about the crisis in Greece is that monetary and fiscal policy are no longer in the hands of the Greeks themselves, but in the EU. So is the lesson that the Greeks need to take charge over their own economy, or that the EU should strengthen its charge over the Greek economy? Thank you.
You want to start going down the list?
Okay. Okay, great. Now, well, thank you. And I also want to thank Will and David for your comments, which got me thinking about a lot of things. So great. I appreciate it a lot. The first point about aggregate demand really has to do with the fact that once the prices changed in the Argentine economy in terms of imports and exports, it meant that this is a largely urbanized country, 80% of the population in cities. They are used to consuming at a fairly high level, goods and services, and those things were then impossible to import. And as a result, it started generating employment for people who didn't have, who at the moment of the crisis were out of work. I have a story, for example, of a man who owned a small factory making cardboard boxes. When the crisis hit, nobody was buying, nobody was doing anything. But once things started happening, the cardboard boxes business became really important because they were selling things. And then he began to purchase other things, and the whole kind of multipliers started moving in the economy. And when I saw him several years after the crisis, he was off taking a tour, a cruise ship in Asia. He had done very well. It was unimaginable 3 years earlier, right? Okay. So the point being that once the multipliers start within the domestic economy, it helps to maintain demand. And this has actually continued now in terms of credit, because one of the issues which probably contributes to the inflation now is that there is so much consumer credit available in the country that everybody's buying things. Last year, they sold more cars than ever in the history of the country. So this is hardly a country in crisis. So I think the aggregate demand was an important part of that. The question about why was the debt deal accepted, I think that the debt deal was accepted mostly because Kirchner stuck to it. And he basically said, we're going to give you 25 cents on the dollar, and it's too bad, we're not going to change. And he hung tough. And it went on for a year, and people worried. It went on for another year. And they basically said, we're not going to come down on this. And actually, at the New School, at one moment, a reporter from the Financial Times said to him, over in the Lang Student Center room, he said, why are you sticking to this? Why are you making it so tough and so difficult on the bondholders? And he said, well, if you ask me again, I think I'll tighten it even more. All right? And sort of the local version of the story, which was, we're not going to back off. All right? And so 76% of the bondholders eventually accepted. There are still outstanding claims in the United States and in Germany and Italy by some bondholders who felt that it wasn't fair. Well, most people did decide it was fair, and one of the interesting things that he said in the whole process, we will issue new bonds, but the return on those bonds will depend on the level of GDP growth in our country. Well, that's very interesting. So if the country was improving, they would pay more, and if it didn't grow, they wouldn't be able to pay. It seems to me that that's a much more sensible and carefully nuanced kind of approach to that problem. On the question of import substitution, there is a big debate right now in Argentina about whether these controls on imports make sense. Right? I mean, there's some aspects of what's going on now which I don't think make sense at all. But I think that generally the concern is, excuse me, that this could again support some domestic production of things that they haven't done. But I think it's too early to determine. I mean, this has only been going on 3 or 4 months at the most. But there's some silly things in these policies that I don't think are really very good. On the question of human rights, I didn't really talk about this, but I think that's quite important. One of the things that's missing in a crisis, and that's missing before, is the question of justice. What's justice? What's social justice? And what's the role of the state in that? And one of the things that struck me in going to Argentina in '97 and living there and spending time for a long period of time was until Kirchner became president, there was virtually no discussion that I heard about what was happening as a result of the dictatorship. There were not trials. There had been an amnesty declared by Menem and the Congress. And Kirchner overturned that amnesty and then began actively starting cases against the former military who had been abusers of human rights. And there were particular moments. I mean, when Kirchner, there was one moment at a ceremony at the military school where he goes up to the wall and he says, "Take down the portrait of Videla, who had led the military dictatorship. That this is not somebody who should be honored in this place." A very powerful signal. And so I think the human rights question and the question of justice is something which is really important. Since 2003, there hasn't been a regular pace. There are times when things have slowed down. Now it's speeding up again with more cases, and I think that's absolutely welcome. Question of what gave Argentina its autonomy or its ability to take the stand. I think that a lot of this really came from Kirchner's own conception of what he could do. I mean, a lot of Argentines feel they're at the end of the world. They're far away, and they can take positions, and they really can take position. And in this case, he was trying out his position, and he was taking a firm line, and I think it allowed him to persist and do this. And the play on the outside was negative. I mean, if you go back and you read what Martin Wolf and Jeff Sachs and all these people are saying already, before you even start, it can't really get much worse, right? The international press was absolutely against the country, and it was sort of one insult after the other. And I think he figured, I will try to work at least for my domestic constituency. And those policies on the debt were absolutely popular, and I think that supported it. The connection with Greece is interesting. What I would read from this is that if the Greeks come out of this with a diminished state, they're in much more trouble than they are just because of their debt, that they would really have to assert the role of the state. What happens in the context of the EU? I think the EU needs to back off on fiscal policy, and I think the problem of not being able to manage your own currency really matters. So a number of commentators have said that they thought this was really the end of the EU in terms of its overall, over the long term, and I would tend to agree with that. It doesn't make sense. It could continue, and then forget about Greece. Greece will be squashed. That's another outcome. But I think that's important. And finally, in terms of Lily's question about the role of the state, I think the role of the state is essential, because if you don't stand up for the interests of the population on many different levels, the economy, the polity, the civil society will deteriorate in many ways. And I wouldn't be surprised if then you begin to see alternative, sort of more authoritarian results. So they really have to stand up for the state.
Other comments or other questions from our panel? Jump in there. Sure, we have plenty of questions. Good. Yeah.
Just to follow on what you just said now, Mike, isn't there an argument then that if Greece were to have returned to the drachma, let its currency go, in the long run it might have strengthened the state, and the European Union arguably is survivable without Greece? What do you say to that argument that if they had gone the other tack, let the drachma go, and let Greece go along itself as Argentina did, maybe in the end both Greece and the European Union come out better? Is that a viable argument, or?
Well, I think it is. I think that's certainly an alternative, because it's not obvious that more austerity that's being imposed on Greece is going to make anything better. And each day, I mean, the news stories of people committing suicide in public places suggest, there's desperation. It's impossible. So, I would rather avert that and have solutions at the national level. I mean, and this goes back to the comments that Will made about globalization, about whether countries, in fact, can survive the power of globalization. And the answer is that if globalization produces irrational outcomes in this structure, this is not acceptable.
Thank you. Mike, I have to read the book, especially since you asked me to read some drafts, and I never was able to get to it. And so I can really appreciate the comment. I mean, I don't run anything, and I couldn't even read the drafts you asked me to read. So I'll look forward to that. Just a comment on the debt and also U.S. policy. In fact, developed country policy at the time of the default. First, there was the assessment, does Argentine default matter to the world financial system? And the answer was no. I mean, the banks were not involved in any serious way that would bring the system down. So, and number two was, at that time, it was another bailout would have been politically impossible in any country, to be supported in Europe or even in the U.S. So when the Bush administration said, Argentina, go screw yourself, they were also equally saying to the bondholders, go screw yourselves, because, you're on your own. And in fact, in Wall Street, the whole last 6 months of 2001, people were dumping Argentine debt, every day, and yeah, okay. Now I wanted to actually ask you a question, which is, when Argentina was a well-behaved country, it was invited into the group of 20. It was then a kind of, a talk shop for finance ministers. Then it became a big deal, heads of state. Argentina is still in it. But you don't hear much about Argentina. You hear about the BRICS, but there's no A in BRICS. So what do you think accounts, or am I wrong, is Argentina more engaged in sort of international debates and taking its lessons forward to other countries and other situations? Thank you.
It's an interesting question, because part of the fact, while Argentina has been a member of the G20, last year it was the president of the Group of 77, which meant that it was the country chairing the developing countries in confrontation with the G20. So it was actually on both sides of the street. And I think that, at least in 2011, there was a lot of emphasis on representing the developing countries. And now I think they probably have a little bit more freedom to operate within the context of the G20. What they do with it, that remains to be seen. And here I don't think that the Obama administration's policies with regard to Latin America, for example, have been particularly helpful. It's going to be interesting to see what happens over the next weekend in this summit in Cartagena, whether in fact the Obama administration works out something that they actually follow through on with the Latin American countries. In a sense, Argentina is not big enough to matter, as comes out, as you suggested, with the question of the size of the debt. It's a relatively small country, and you look at how the United States has treated Brazil in the last few days, not really paid much attention to Brazil either. So, Argentina is 20% of Brazil, so I have some real questions about whether they'll be able to carry a lot of weight in the discussion But that's one of the reasons, and for me, actually one of the motivating reasons of writing the book, which is that I wanted the case to be brought into the English conversation, right? And there are many, many books in Spanish about Argentina, not very many books in English, and so that's part of the motivation.
Maybe I could jump in here, and I wanted to follow up on something Will had said at the end of his remarks about the future of Argentina, and I think it made some very good policy choices when it was in the middle of the crisis, but now there is a lot of concern. Now, you could say it was the same, it's coming from the same people who were concerned about Argentina back in 2001 when they started the policy. On the other hand, it may be something of things we should be concerned about, and should Argentina be changing some of its policies in one direction or another? You mentioned the import issues. What is your view going forward of Argentina?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure I would go with, I think Will made the comment, some people think it's falling off the cliff. I don't think that it's that concerning, but I do think that the policies which got out of the crisis are not the same policies which manage for the long term. So a country that is not investing significantly in its own energy, that's not significantly worrying about science and technology, that's not developing education properly, there are a whole series of questions which raise the issue about long-term crisis and whether the country will be able to compete, let's say, 10, 20 years ahead because it didn't take actions now. So I think those are real questions. But in some sense, and this is where the politics and the economics come together, what leads? How much political support do you have to undertake real reform? How much wealth and positive surplus do you have to allow people to feel comfortable for political change? And I think that's not so clear. So the sequences and the balances are real problems. And that's actually where I think both in political science and economics it would be interesting to think about. That is, what are those mixes? What are the enabling conditions which allow real change at this time? I'm hopeful that with her large majority in the last election, the president will be able to introduce real change. We'll see whether she can do it. But it is a matter of concern.
What do you mean by real change? What do you mean?
Well, I think that the real test beyond the crisis will be the institutional legacy of the regime. That is, whether in fact the institutions are working, whether the institutions of the state are working, and whether the population is educated in a proper way to go ahead. And I think that in the hurry to deal with the crisis, they haven't always dealt with the institutions. So one of the critiques in the country is that there's been too much power concentrated at the very top. There hasn't been enough delegation. There hasn't been enough decentralization. I mean, one of the things, for example, that given my interest in urban issues, there's really no urban policy. There's no attention to local government. There's no attention to how the provinces could develop. Well, the country's big enough to have a serious decentralized policy. So there's a big agenda of things that they need to do.
Other questions?
Thank you, Michael, and the Observatory for inviting us, having us, for the detailed explanations. I just want to point out something, a specific remark and / question. You said that one of the sources or one of the prerequisites to achieve this outstanding economic growth, in the case of Argentina, is to get rid of the conventional wisdom or the approach provided by the Washington Consensus. Do you recognize to what extent there was a new approach, a new academic production? The scholar are recognizing this shift. There is in the mainstream, in spite of some names that you mentioned, some sacred codes, there is a big difference, and the scholars began to recognize this and write about this in a visible manner. This is one. I mean, the consequence in the academic field. The second one is you mentioned repeatedly mentioned that there is a lot of things that are still pending issues in the social developmental agenda, in spite of the economic growth. Some sort of lack of correlation between both situations. Do you think this can be blamed or the bottom put in the limits of the model, or something that has to do with the deleterious effects of the previous economic and social structures that came from the 19th and 20th century, or is much more to do with systemic conditions that some constraint to the Argentinian government to pursue a developmental agenda beyond the consequence of the economic growth, go into the pending issues and the social aspect? Thank you.
Right. Good points, both. I think on the first point, there really is a discussion in Argentina about alternative economic models. Anwar was at a meeting 2 weeks ago in Buenos Aires of heterodox economists, and I think the fact that such a thing would even happen there suggests that there is a debate, and there's a lot more discussion in Argentina about alternative policies. The central bank governor and many other people, many of whom are New School graduates, Martina Bellis and others, they're certainly people who are very much aware of the need for alternative models, and that's getting into the literature, into the discussion. The fact that there are serious problems, I mean, for example, the education problem or the problem of youth in the country. I think if you've pursued policies which produce a lot of inequality, that becomes a legacy of those policies, and it's not so easy to solve those things. If you have lots of 20-year-olds who don't have a decent education, who don't have employment, who get on drugs, how do you solve that problem? We don't solve that problem very well here, right? So I think the issue of the legacy of policies, the lag of those things, is really, really significant. Whether the government has been active enough in thinking about education policy and health policy and doing things to correct some of those problems, we'll see. I think there's been a step in that direction, but the legacy of the past is still a major problem.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering what your opinion is about the level of corruption and to what extent and in what realms exists corruption in Argentina.
Well, corruption is a hot topic, right? I mean, everybody talks about corruption, and then you look and you see the way the North says that Argentina is very corrupt, or there are all kinds of problems, and then we have the issues here, and I say, well, here we take big money, there we take small money, but there's a problem of corruption. I mean, I think there are issues of corruption. I think there are problems about contracts and their stories and all those kinds of things. Is there strong evidence of that? Is there data on that? I think that's harder to find. I don't know. That I haven't really focused on that. But I do think we have to be a little clearer about what is the measure by which we are assessing those things. When I mention corruption to friends in Argentina, they say, well, yeah, but don't you have something called white-collar crime in the States? And we don't have Madoff, or we don't have that. I mean, so I think the relative position is a significant issue.
Go ahead. Yep.
So one person. To follow on the question about corruption, and I've been thinking about this before when I think you mentioned the level of direct foreign investment that began in Argentina from the mid-2000s on. How much of that was actually fresh direct foreign investment, and are there any figures? Did you look into how much of the funds coming into the country were from returning capital flight that had previously left? Did the policies of Kirchner, in fact, re-attract Argentine capital that had left the country in the previous 5 to 10 years before?
One of the issues that has been discussed historically was, given the level of capital flight, was some of that money sort of not legitimate money in the first place, right? And so one of the things that the government did was said that if you repatriate some of the overseas holdings, it will be made legitimate, right, as a way to bring it back. Well, that was kind of interesting, right? And I think it helped bring some money back. But a lot of there's a lot of investment, for example, from Brazil. There's a lot of foreign investment from Brazil, and that's been a major part.
I think a lot of the investment that came in during the Kirchner period, in contrast to before then, was equity investment, right, as opposed to debt. And in a sense, if your currency is devalued, it makes that very attractive. You take on, even if there is more risk, it's worthwhile taking that that investment on.
Right.
Yeah. So, but that may in the long term be better for the country in terms of having solid equity investment in the country rather than debt, which can leave more quickly.
Right.
More questions?
So Mike, at one point you said that that President Kirchner was guided by an ethical vision. And I'm curious whether he or you can articulate what they meant by this, what he meant by this ethical vision, because somewhere it seems to indicate a vision that is distinct from a political vision. And I'm just curious to hear more about what you mean by the space of the ethical.
Yeah, I think the observation that it doesn't make sense to pay foreign debt when people are starving in your country, you could interpret that as a political statement, or you could say, well, there's an ethical component to that. How much of that is an ethical statement? I mean, it's very hard to determine, but it seemed to me that that's a major issue. And I don't know, there may have been a few people in the room now who were here in 2003. I think you were, right, David? You heard that. Christina Kirchner got up, Bob Kerrey invited Christina to get up in the room, and she got up and gave everybody a lecture about ethics. She said, you know, you people are in the center and we're in the periphery, and there's some sort of ethical responsibility about understanding our circumstances. We're really in a lot of trouble and terrible problems of deprivation, and you know, and then sort of laid out an argument, almost a moral argument, why they were going to take care of home first before worrying about the outside. So it'd be interesting to go back actually and try to find all the detailed statements of that, almost in a textual way, to make the case. But I think that was a large part of that. And she actually came here when Barry Herman ran a meeting here in 2005, when we had a project called Ethics and Debt, and Christina came and spoke in that meeting, and she talked about ethical issues. Right? We filled up Tishman this is 2005, and she was talking about the ethical component of that. So we could find that actually. That would probably be a useful thing to circulate. So.
This was a really nice presentation, just a very clear presentation of an extraordinarily complicated topic, and extremely thoughtful comments that have prompted a lot of thoughts in my mind. And if I could follow one, it's the idea of how idiosyncratic things are. And the question of how much latitude they had to say that we're going to focus on the poor in the country rather than the debt holders. And I would go to Robert's question of, can you look at the issue of how much Argentines being attracted back to buy things at 25 cents on the dollar sustained their ability to not be overthrown and not to bear the costs of not paying off the debt holders and having the economy crash even further. That if you did have this repatriation that kept them going until the Chinese money came in, that in fact there was a highly idiosyncratic circumstance that led to this ability to do what they did, as courageous as it was, that they were assisted by, as Professor Plotky said, some desirable or beneficial idiosyncratic circumstances that helped it along. Did you look at that, and do you have any response to that?
Some of the bondholders were Argentines, but most of them were non-Argentine. There were Americans, there were Canadians and Germans and Italians. So I think it was more whether these foreign people would accept the deal. But I think there was something that I think Argentines were proud that the government was taking a tough line on the debt. I mean, one of the things that was always very striking to me was that if you bought an Argentine bond in 2001 in Toronto, I remember this is a specific case, you got a 76% return on it, which was kind of incredible. So they were paying very high rates on these bonds. unacceptably high rates, and that reflected the toughness of their circumstance that they were in. So the idea that maybe that we're not going to pay the full bond back, that wasn't such a terrible thing, I think, probably, for some of the people. And that probably explains why so many people actually finally accepted the deal. But again, this question of the sequences and which things allowed them this ability to survive, maybe it's idiosyncratic. The book is trying to argue that maybe it's not.
Well, just to follow up on that point, I think the difference between 1985, the debt crisis then, and this particular crisis was who was holding the debt too. Because when it was the international banks holding the debt, and the governments got much more involved. But now, probably many of the people who agreed to the rescheduling in 2001 were people who bought the debt on 25 cents on the dollar someplace else, and it was easier for them to say, okay, yeah, I'll take my profits. Somebody else had already taken the loss, but it was. Right. But it made it easier. I think it made it more. The government had more flexibility because of that. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, and I know because you were my teacher that you put a lot of effort in explaining like the importance of the city and the urban economy in the growth of the country, of the overall economy. And I was thinking in the specific case for Argentina, how do you think that the urban economy helps for the economic recovery? And I was thinking also in the housing policy that the government implemented, and also the nationalization of some public utilities. And if that kind of policy also helps to put some like guidelines from other cases. You're talking about also like the U.S. and how little the stimulus package put money or some like in the idea for making the cities grow.
Right. I think this book kind of hints at the point that the urban economy is critical to the recovery, but I don't really come out and develop it enough. And as a result of one of the conferences that we've had, there's another book coming out at the end of May, which is an edited volume, which includes people who participated in that, and there's much more discussion of the urban economy. But we have actually in the program, we have students and people who are studying this question of the urban economy, because I think this really is a major issue. That if these countries are becoming more and more urban and their economies are more and more urban, we ought to be thinking about the urban component of the macroeconomy. It ought to be a big part of the story, right? And it's just like the housing crisis, or the financial crisis here was precipitated by a housing crisis, that maybe it's the urban economy which can help to remedy these situations in other places. So.
One other thing, Michael, while you were talking, I was trying to think, I think most of us thought about Greece, that issue's coming up, but I actually thought about another country, and it sort of raises the question of how, really novel the Argentine approach was. And maybe it's happened before, and I was actually thinking the United States in 1933, and if I take your 4 steps, ignore external debt, well, we essentially did that by going off the gold standard. Strengthen the state. The Roosevelt, the New Deal was all about doing that, which included, which I think is very important in improving the safety net in the economy. Absolutely. For that. The only one I couldn't figure out was the regional framework behind it, but I thought it was fairly analogous. The policy steps were pretty similar at that time. I don't know if you have a reaction to that, or I'm missing something.
It's a very interesting comparison. I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, I think it would be interesting to explore more sort of the FDR or the period of the New Deal in relationship. Although I would say that in some of the more progressive newspaper articles during the period of the Argentine crisis, there was reference to the New Deal and the need for New Deal-like policies. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but it's interesting to make those historical parallels. Yeah.
I would just add one. This was at the margin.
Yeah, it is Mike here.
this is at the margins of that exchange, but it also engages the ethics thing a little bit. It seems to me that one of the things that made it work a little bit better in Argentina was that Kirchner had a reputation as being honest. This is actually an important, I don't know of a study about this that would get at the point I want to make, so I'll make it very quickly. I think if you want to do, I guess, what I could broadly call social democratic intervention in these kinds of places, being honest is a big advantage. Having a reputation as being honest is a big advantage, because what it does is it allays the fear that state building is just going to go quite soon toward various private interests, either big ones or little ones. And so I can think of a number of cases where what you could call left or reformist governments, especially in regions, have gained power and then stayed around partly because, I mean, I can think of cases in Italy, famously with parts of the Italian Communist Party, cases in India, cases in other places, where the commitment of the reformist, or whatever you want to call the kind of regime, to state building was made easier and made more credible by a prior record of good behavior in government, so that people who are not necessarily crazy about the expansion of the state in that area at least thought that the guy was not a crook and was not trying to do it merely as a device to enrich his party members. So I think, I read a little bit of that in Mike's account, but Argentina does not have a wonderful history in that regard either. So if somebody is a honest administrator, governor, and is not relatively unscarred by that, it's a big plus for one of these, what you're calling a state building project. I mean, a lot of the fear of the state is not that you're going to get Bulgaria in Argentina, but you're just going to get some new rotten contraption that under the guise of building the state just extracts resources, is just rent-seeking and mendaciousness. So.
Well, any more questions? Kept everybody up here for quite a while, but it's been fascinating, and congratulations, Michael, on a tremendous book, and thank you to our commentators.